Rain fell in thin, relentless lines across the city, turning glass towers into blurred ghosts and swallowing the last traces of night. The streets were empty in that strange hour before dawn, when even the restless seemed to pause, when the world held its breath between darkness and morning. A black armored sedan cut through the silence, its headlights slicing across wet asphalt, engine humming low and controlled, like the man sitting inside it. Adrian Voss sat in the back seat, one hand resting loosely against his jaw, eyes half-lidded but alert beneath the fatigue. His suit jacket lay folded beside him, his shirt collar slightly open, carrying the faint, expensive scent of a woman who was not his wife. The night clung to him. Whiskey, perfume, dim hotel lights, whispered laughter that now felt distant and irrelevant. He had already compartmentalized it, filed it away under indulgence, under necessity, under the quiet entitlement of a man who believed his world existed to serve him. The estate gates appeared ahead, iron and imposing, rising out of the mist like the entrance to something older than the city itself. They opened before the car even slowed, sensors recognizing him, security systems responding with silent obedience. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Control intact. As it should be. The car rolled up the long gravel drive, tires crunching softly, the massive silhouette of his estate emerging through the rain. Lights were off, curtains drawn, peaceful, contained, exactly how he preferred it. Inside, he expected stillness, the predictable rhythm of his life. His wife asleep, the baby quiet or stirring just enough to wake the night nurse. Order, routine, ownership. The car stopped beneath the covered entrance. The driver stepped out first, opening Adrian's door, but Adrian didn't move immediately. He watched the house for a moment, studying it the way a man studies something he owns, something that has never once defied him. Then he stepped out into the cold. Rain kissed his skin, sharp and clean, cutting through the haze in his head. He straightened his cuffs, adjusted his posture, and walked toward the front door with measured confidence. The door unlocked at his touch, biometric recognition granting him entry without hesitation. Inside, silence greeted him. Not the soft, lived-in silence of a sleeping home, but something else, something hollow, the kind of silence that doesn't rest, the kind that listens. Adrian paused just inside the doorway, the faintest crease forming between his brows. The air felt wrong, too still, too empty. The usual scent of the house, lavender detergent, warm milk, faint traces of Alina's perfume was gone, replaced by nothing. Sterile, clean in a way that didn't belong to life. He stepped further in, shoes echoing softly against marble floors. "Alina," he called, his voice low, controlled. The sound didn't carry the way it should have. It seemed to sink into the walls instead of filling them. No answer. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, sharp and brief. She should have been here, even if asleep, even if exhausted. There were rules to this house. Patterns, predictability. His world did not shift without his permission. He moved through the ground floor quickly, checking the kitchen first. The counters were spotless. No bottles, no late-night remnants. The coffee machine sat cold and untouched. Everything looked reset. To reset. Adrian's steps grew faster as he crossed into the living area. The digital frame that usually cycled through family photos was gone, leaving a clean rectangle on the wall where dust hadn't settled. He stopped there for a fraction of a second, staring at the empty space, something tightening in his chest. No, this wasn't right. He turned sharply and took the stairs two at a time, control slipping just enough to sharpen his movements. The hallway upstairs stretched long and dim, doors closed, the air heavier here, quieter. The master bedroom door stood slightly open. Adrian pushed it wider. The bed was made. Not disturbed, not slept in, pulled tight with precision that felt deliberate, final. The absence hit him harder now, pressing against his ribs. "Alina," he called again, louder this time. Nothing. The irritation was gone now, replaced by something colder, something unfamiliar. His heartbeat began to climb, slow but steady, like a warning drum. He moved down the hall. The nursery door was closed. For a moment, just a moment, he hesitated. Not out of fear, not yet, but out of something instinctive. Something that told him the world on the other side of that door would not match the one he had left behind. He opened it. The room was empty. Not just empty of a child, empty of life. The crib stood in the center of the room, stripped down to its bare frame. No sheets, no blanket. The mobile that once spun softly above it was gone, leaving only a faint hook in the ceiling. The shelves were cleared. No toys, no diapers, no trace of the careful, quiet chaos that came with a newborn. Adrian stepped inside slowly, his gaze moving across the room, absorbing each absence one piece at a time. Gone. All of it gone. The realization didn't hit like an explosion. It crept in, cold and methodical, settling into his bones with terrifying clarity. This wasn't panic, this wasn't impulsive. This was planned. His breathing slowed, not from calm, but from something darker, something calculating. His mind began to piece it together even as disbelief tried to resist it. No alarms triggered, no guards alerted, no signs of struggle. She hadn't been taken. She had left. Adrian stood in the center of the stripped nursery, rain tapping faintly against the windows, the empty crib staring back at him like an accusation. And for the first time in years, a thought formed that did not belong to control. He hadn't lost something by accident. He had been outplayed. Morning did not arrive gently. It forced its way through the storm, a pale gray light bleeding into the estate as if the sky itself was unsure whether this house deserved daybreak. Adrian Voss stood in the center of the nursery long after the first shock had settled, his reflection faintly visible in the dark window glass. A man used to commanding empires now staring at the clean absence of his own bloodline. The silence had changed shape, no longer hollow but suffocating, pressing inward with a deliberate weight that made the room feel smaller than it was. He moved at last, slow, controlled, stepping toward the crib as if it might still contain something hidden, some overlooked detail that would restore logic to the scene. His fingers brushed the wooden rail, and it was cold, colder than it should have been, as though it had been abandoned not hours ago but days, weeks, as if time itself had been erased along with everything else. No scent of powder, no faint trace of milk, no echo of a child's presence lingered here, and that absence was louder than any scream. He turned sharply, leaving the nursery behind, his movements gaining precision as instinct began to replace disbelief. Because men like Adrian did not stay stunned for long, they adapted, recalculated, reasserted dominance. The hallway stretched before him like a corridor in a fortress under siege, every closed door suddenly suspect, every shadow holding possibility. He entered the master bedroom again, this time not as a husband returning home but as a strategist surveying a compromised territory. Elena Voss had not simply left, she had erased herself with lid open under his hand, revealing a vacuum where her life had once been, hangers spaced too neatly, as if mocking him with their order. No scattered items, no rushed packing, no forgotten details. This was not escape driven by fear. This was departure executed with patience. Adrian's jaw tightened, a faint pulse beating at his temple as his mind began to reconstruct the timeline with ruthless clarity. She had known, not recently, not impulsively, but long enough to prepare, long enough to dismantle her existence piece by piece without triggering his notice or his systems. The realization was not loud, not dramatic. It settled into him like a blade sliding between ribs, precise and undeniable. He moved into the bathroom, already expecting the result before he saw it. Her toothbrush was gone. Her perfume bottles were gone. Even the small, inconsequential items, hair ties, lotions, the quiet clutter of daily life, had vanished. No woman leaves behind her life unless she intends never to return. His hand reached for the counter, steadying himself not out of weakness but calculation, because something larger was forming beneath the surface of this moment, something that threatened more than his pride. This was not just a wife leaving. This was a breach in his control, a fracture in the illusion that nothing within his world could move without his command. He stepped back into the hallway and descended the stairs, slower now, each step measured, his mind racing ahead of his body, mapping possibilities, eliminating variables. No alarms had triggered. No guards had reported movement. That meant she had bypassed his security or someone had allowed her through it. Both options were unacceptable. The living room greeted him with the same sterile emptiness, but now he saw more small details emerging under scrutiny. The absence of dust outlines where objects had been removed. The unnatural symmetry of surfaces wiped clean. The air itself felt scrubbed, as if she had removed not only her presence but any trace that she had ever existed within these walls. Adrian's gaze swept across the space until it settled on the kitchen island, where something broke the pattern of disappearance by its very existence. A single object rested at the center, placed with intention, not forgotten, not discarded. He approached it slowly, the weight in his chest tightening with every step until it became something dangerously close to anticipation. The marble surface reflected the object faintly, doubling its significance, forcing him to confront it before he even touched it. A ring. Her ring. The diamond caught the dim light, cold and distant, stripped of sentiment, reduced to a symbol that no longer held power over her. Beside it lay his private key, the one only he carried, the one that represented absolute access, absolute authority within these walls. He stared at them both, understanding forming not in pieces now but as a complete, devastating truth. This was not abandonment, this was a message. Adrian picked up the ring, feeling its chill against his skin, and for the first time since stepping into the house, something shifted inside him that he could not immediately control. Confusion had already given way to fear, but this was something sharper, something personal. She had not fled from him. She had walked away from him. She had left behind the symbols of everything he believed bound her, returned them like a contract terminated without negotiation. And in that moment, standing in the center of his silent empire, Adrian Voss understood something far more dangerous than loss. He understood that while he had been indulging himself, believing his world unshakable, his wife had been dismantling it piece by piece, right under his nose. This was not chaos. This was not desperation. This was precision. This was intent. This was war, and he had not even realized the first move had already been made. The rain had stopped, but the estate did not breathe again. It remained suspended in a sterile stillness that felt less like aftermath and more like containment, as if something invisible had sealed it from the rest of the world. Adrian Voss stood in the center of the living room with Alina's ring still in his hand, the cold metal pressing into his palm hard enough to leave a mark, grounding him as the last remnants of disbelief burned away. What replaced it was not grief, not even anger, not yet, but calculation, sharp and immediate, the instinct of a man who had built an empire by turning uncertainty into strategy. He lifted his head slowly, eyes scanning the room again, not as a husband searching for answers but as a commander assessing a breach, and in that shift, something in him hardened completely. This was no longer personal in the way it should have been. It had become structural, a failure of control, and that made it unforgivable. Within minutes, the estate began to move. Silent corridors filled with the low murmur of controlled urgency as his inner circle was summoned without explanation, men who did not ask questions when Adrian Voss called before dawn. Security feeds were pulled up, monitors flickering to life in the private control room beneath the house, casting pale light across the faces of men who understood immediately that something had gone very wrong. Adrian entered without acknowledging them, his presence alone enough to tighten the air, his silence more threatening than any command. Footage rolled back hour by hour, each camera angle dissected, each movement scrutinized, but what unfolded on the screens was more disturbing than chaos. It was absence. No alarms, no forced entries, no suspicious shadows. Only routine patterns, guards rotating, lights dimming, the house behaving exactly as it always did. Except at one point, a subtle anomaly appeared, so small it might have been missed by anyone less trained. A blind spot lasting precisely 47 seconds across 3 overlapping cameras. A synchronized blackout that should not have been possible within a system Adrian himself had designed. He leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tightening as the timestamp looped again and again, each repetition sharpening the realization until it became undeniable. This wasn't a glitch. It was interference. Someone had accessed the system, not from outside, but from within its architecture, someone who knew how to cut vision without triggering alerts, how to erase movement without leaving traces. The room grew colder as that understanding spread through the men behind him, their silence shifting from confusion to unease. Adrian did not turn to them, but his voice, when it came, was low and absolute, carrying a weight that left no space for interpretation. Find out who touched my system. No one moved immediately, not because they hesitated, but because they understood the implications. If the breach had come from inside, then this was no longer a missing person situation. It was infiltration. His thoughts moved faster now, assembling fragments that no longer resisted connection. Alina Voss had not only planned her disappearance, she had studied him, his systems, his patterns, his blind spots, and she had done it without altering her behavior enough to trigger suspicion. That meant she had help, and not just any help, but someone capable of navigating the internal mechanics of a fortified estate designed to withstand attack from rival families. Adrian straightened slowly, the tension in his body coiling into something far more dangerous than anger. It wasn't the fact that she had left that unsettled him now. It was how she had done it, the precision, the patience, the understanding of his world that he had never believed she possessed. He had underestimated her, and in his world, underestimation was the first step toward destruction. A phone vibrated softly on the table behind him, breaking the rhythm of the room. One of his men glanced down, hesitated, then lifted it carefully. "Sir, it's from the bank." Adrian took the phone without looking away from the monitors, his fingers steady as he brought it to his ear. The voice on the other end was controlled but strained, the kind of tone reserved for delivering information that could not be undone. "There's been movement on your joint accounts. Significant movement." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression did not change. "How significant?" "A pause, everything, sir. Liquid assets transferred overnight. Multiple transactions, layered routing. We're still tracing, but it's already gone." The word settled into the room like a final verdict. Gone. Adrian ended the call without responding, placing the phone back down with deliberate calm, but the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was charged, volatile, ready to fracture. Money could be replaced. Systems could be rebuilt. But this was coordinated dismantling. His gaze returned to the frozen frame of the security feed, the empty corridor where she had passed unseen, and for the first time since stepping into the house, something flickered beneath the surface of his control, not weakness, not panic, but something far more unsettling. Respect. Because this was not the work of a frightened wife escaping betrayal. This was the work of someone who had studied him, waited for the precise moment of vulnerability, and then executed a plan that stripped him not just of his family, but of the illusion that he was untouchable. And as that realization settled fully into place, Adrian Voss understood that whatever game he thought he had been playing, he had already lost the first round. By the time the sun finally forced its way through the thinning clouds, the estate no longer felt like a home. It had become a command center under silent siege, every room occupied not by life but by intent, by the quiet machinery of a man preparing for war. Adrian Voss stood at the far end of his private office, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a city that still believed he controlled it, his reflection faint against the glass as if even his own image was beginning to separate from him. The ring lay on his desk now, no longer clutched but not dismissed, positioned with the same deliberate precision Alina had used when she left it behind, and every time his eyes flicked toward it, the message sharpened rather than dulled. This was not abandonment. This was strategy written in silence. The door opened without announcement, a privilege granted only to one man in this house, and Victor Hale stepped inside with the controlled urgency of someone who understood that information, not emotion, was the currency of survival here. He carried a thin black folder, but the weight in his posture suggested it held more than paper. Adrian did not turn immediately, letting the seconds stretch until they became a test, a measure of how steady the room remained under pressure. Victor did not speak until Adrian's voice cut through the silence, low and measured. "Tell me something I don't already know." Victor crossed the room and placed the folder on the desk, opening it with a deliberate calm that contrasted with the storm building beneath the surface. "She didn't just disappear last night," he said, each word chosen carefully. "She started disappearing weeks ago." Adrian's gaze shifted, finally landing on the contents of the file, and what he saw there did not provoke shock but something more dangerous, a tightening of understanding. Bank withdrawals that were too small to trigger alerts, spaced across weeks. Purchases made in cash, items that would mean nothing on their own, travel gear, burner phones, prepaid cards, but together formed a pattern so clean it was almost elegant. Property records traced through shell companies that led nowhere and everywhere at once. She built this slowly, Victor continued, without ever breaking routine. She stayed predictable, invisible. Adrian's fingers tapped once against the desk, the only outward sign of the shift happening inside him. Invisible. The word lingered, heavy with implication. Alina Voss had lived in his world for years, surrounded by power, violence, control, and yet he had never considered that she might learn from it, adapt to it, use it. He had mistaken her quiet for weakness, her stillness for submission, and now the evidence of that miscalculation lay spread out before him like a map of his own failure. Who helped her, Adrian asked, not as a question but as a demand for precision. Victor slid a photograph across the desk, its edges slightly worn, its origin buried in places that rarely saw daylight. A woman stared back from the image, her expression sharp, unreadable, a sleeve of ink crawling up one arm like a history written in code. Mara Kane, Victor said quietly, the name settling into the room with the weight of reputation. Identity broker, disappearance specialist. She's been off the grid for years, but traces of her work keep surfacing. New names, clean exits, people who vanish so completely they become rumors instead of targets. Adrian's eyes did not leave the photograph, but something behind them shifted, aligning pieces that had been scattered until now. Alina's past had always been a sealed box, one he had never bothered to open because it held no value to him then. Now it was the key to everything. They were in the same foster system, Victor continued, his voice steady, filling in the gaps that had once seemed irrelevant. Shared placement for almost a year. Records are thin, but enough to confirm they stayed in contact longer than anyone realized. Adrian exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, but the implications were not. This was not a chance alliance. This was history, trust built long before he entered Alina's life, long before she became his wife, before she became something he believed he owned. You're telling me, Adrian said, his tone dropping further, that my wife aligned herself with a ghost. Victor met his gaze without flinching. I'm telling you she didn't just leave you. She planned her disappearance with someone who knows how to erase people from systems like yours. The room seemed to contract around that statement, the air tightening as the reality of it settled into place. Adrian straightened, turning fully now, his expression stripped of anything resembling doubt. Weeks, he repeated almost to himself, the word carrying a quiet, lethal clarity. She watched me for weeks. She waited. He walked back to the desk, picking up the photograph, studying Mara Kane's face as if memorizing it would bring him closer to the truth. The rain had stopped outside, but the city still looked washed out, as if something had been removed from it, something essential. Inside the office, the silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was focused. Adrian placed the photograph down beside the ring, the two objects forming a silent equation, past and present, ally and message. And for the first time since this began, something close to anticipation stirred beneath the surface of his control. Not because he was closer to finding her, but because he now understood the scale of what she had done. This was not escape driven by fear or betrayal. This was a calculated withdrawal from a world she had outgrown, executed with the help of someone who specialized in making the impossible look effortless. And as Adrian Voss looked down at the evidence of her preparation, at the quiet proof that she had been building this exit while he was busy believing in his own untouchable power, a single thought settled into place with absolute certainty. He had not been betrayed in a moment of weakness. He had been studied, measured, and then removed from her life with the precision of a man eliminating a threat. Which meant she had never been the fragile piece on his board. She had been a player all along. The city did not notice when the hunt began, but beneath its routine, beneath traffic lights and office towers and quiet morning coffee, something vast and deliberate started to move. Adrian Voss did not raise his voice, did not slam his fist against tables or make theatrical declarations. He simply gave a series of quiet instructions, and the world bent around them. Men disappeared from their usual posts and reappeared in places they were never meant to be. Systems were accessed that were never meant to be touched, and money flowed through channels that existed only in the shadows. What had begun as a missing wife was now something else entirely. It was a hunt, and Adrian was not looking for Alina as a husband. He was tracking her as a strategist tracking a target that had slipped beyond acceptable limits. Information came fast at first, like rain hitting glass, loud, constant, but ultimately shallow. Financial institutions reported the same thing. The funds were gone, not transferred in a single movement but broken into fragments, scattered across accounts that dissolved as soon as they appeared. The pattern was deliberate, layered with misdirection, a technique used by professionals who understood how to make money disappear without leaving a trail that could be followed backward. Adrian stood in his office as each report was delivered, his expression unreadable, but inside, something sharpened further. This was not desperation spending. This was staging. Every dollar she moved was another piece of distance placed between herself and the life she had abandoned. He shifted to another front. Communications. Every known contact Alina had ever used was pulled, analyzed, stripped down to its bare structure. Phones, emails, social media accounts, anything that could carry a signal was examined with surgical precision. And yet the result was the same across every channel, nothing. Not silence born of inactivity, but silence created by removal. Accounts didn't go dormant, they vanished. Data didn't stop, it was erased. It was as if she had not simply left the network but had been extracted from it entirely, leaving no echo behind. The technicians working under Adrian exchanged uneasy glances, their expertise suddenly inadequate against something that operated outside conventional systems. This wasn't amateur work. This was expertise that matched, or even exceeded, the systems Adrian himself relied on. Victor remained at his side, feeding him updates without embellishment, each piece of information landing like another confirmation of what they were facing. Victor Hale did not attempt to soften the truth, because men like Adrian did not need comfort, they needed clarity. "She's not running," Victor said at one point, his voice cutting through the steady stream of reports. "She's relocating." The distinction hung in the air, subtle but devastating. Running implied fear, chaos, mistakes. Relocating implied planning, confidence, destination. Adrian turned slightly at that, his gaze drifting toward the window where the city stretched out beneath him, still unaware that one of its most controlled powers had just been challenged. Destination, he repeated quietly, the words settling into his thoughts like a key sliding into a lock. If she had a destination, then this wasn't infinite escape. It was movement with intent, which meant there would be patterns, not in what she left behind, but in where she was going. He pivoted again, widening the scope of the search beyond systems and into the underworld itself. Old alliances were contacted, debts were called in, whispers spread through circles that rarely intersected. Information brokers were paid before they even knew what they were being paid for, and names began to surface, not confirmed, not solid, but enough to build a picture. The name that appeared more than once was the same one Victor had already placed on his desk, Mara Kane. It surfaced in fragments, in passing mentions, in half-finished conversations that cut off the moment they became too clear. Wherever Mara Kane operated, clarity disappeared with her. Adrian absorbed all of it without outward reaction, but internally the structure of the situation was becoming undeniable. Alina had not simply left his world. She had stepped into another one, a parallel network built on invisibility instead of dominance, on erasure instead of control. And for the first time since the hunt began, he encountered something he could not immediately overpower. Not resistance, not opposition, but absence. There was nothing to strike, nothing to intimidate, nothing to dismantle. Every path he followed dissolved before he could reach its end. That was when the frustration began to take shape, not explosive, but contained, like pressure building behind reinforced walls. Adrian moved through his office slowly, each step deliberate, each breath measured, as if controlling the pace of his body could contain the shift happening in his mind. This was no longer about retrieving what had been taken. It was about reestablishing dominance over a situation that had slipped beyond his grasp. And yet every move he made confirmed the same truth. She had already accounted for him. Every system he relied on, every method he used, every advantage he believed was his, she had anticipated it. He stopped at his desk, his gaze settling on the ring again, that single, silent object that had started all of this. It no longer looked like a symbol of loss. It looked like a marker, a point on a timeline that he had failed to see. Weeks of preparation, layers of planning, a partner who specialized in disappearance. And him, distracted, indulgent, convinced that nothing in his life could move without his knowledge. Adrian picked up the ring once more, turning it slowly between his fingers, the diamond catching the light in a way that felt almost mocking. Then, with a quiet motion, he set it back down exactly where it had been, aligning it with the edge of the desk as if restoring order to something that had been disrupted. But the order he restored was superficial, a thin layer over something far more volatile. Because beneath it all, a realization had taken hold that could not be undone. He was not chasing a mistake. He was chasing a plan that had already succeeded. The first real lead did not arrive with certainty. It arrived disguised as noise, buried beneath the endless stream of half-truths and misdirection that had defined the hunt so far, but Adrian Voss recognized it instantly because it did not behave like the others. It resisted. It didn't collapse under pressure or dissolve when traced. It bent, shifted, and then reappeared somewhere else, like something alive that refused to be pinned down. That alone made it valuable. He stood in the dim glow of his private war room, screens casting cold light across his face, while one of his analysts replayed the data again and again, trying to reduce it to something predictable. A shell company tied to rural property holdings, layered ownership, names that led nowhere but one transaction, small, almost insignificant, had slipped through the filters because it wasn't designed to stand out. It was designed to be overlooked. A supply purchase routed through a third-tier vendor, delivered to a location that technically did not exist on any active registry. The kind of detail that meant nothing to most men and everything to someone who understood how to disappear. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as the coordinates resolved on the screen, a stretch of land so remote it might as well have been erased from the map. No major roads, no nearby infrastructure, no surveillance coverage worth mentioning. Isolation by design. His mind moved quickly now, connecting it to everything he had already learned, to the name that had become the center of this unraveling. Mara Kane did not hide people in cities where they could be found. She placed them where the world itself made searching impractical. The pattern fit too cleanly to ignore. Victor stood a few steps behind him, watching the same data with a different kind of focus, one shaped by caution rather than instinct. Victor Hale did not interrupt immediately, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many operations collapse because of overconfidence. It could be a decoy. Adrian didn't look away from the screen. Everything could be a decoy. That doesn't make it irrelevant. The answer came without hesitation, without doubt, because doubt was something he had already burned out of himself. What remained was intent. The decision to move personally did not surprise anyone, but it unsettled them. Men like Adrian did not chase, they commanded, but this was no longer a situation that could be resolved from a distance. Too many layers had been placed between him and the target, too many systems rendered ineffective. To break through, he needed proximity. He needed to see it for himself. Preparations began immediately, stripped down to essentials, no unnecessary movement, no visible trail. The jet was ready within the hour, engines already humming by the time Adrian stepped onto the tarmac, the early light turning the wet ground into a dull mirror beneath his feet. The flight passed in silence, not the empty kind but the kind filled with calculation, each minute bringing him closer to something that had already proven it could outmaneuver him. He did not sleep. He did not distract himself. He watched the horizon through the small oval window, the landscape shifting from dense urban sprawl to open stretches of land that felt increasingly detached from everything he controlled. By the time they landed, the world looked different, wider, quieter, indifferent. The drive that followed was longer than it should have been, the road narrowing gradually until asphalt gave way to gravel, then to something less defined, a path rather than a route. The air grew sharper, colder, the kind that stripped away illusion and left only what was real. Adrian sat in the passenger seat now, his posture rigid, his attention fixed ahead as the vehicle moved deeper into terrain that seemed designed to erase presence. No cameras, no witnesses, no interference. When the cabin finally came into view, it did not announce itself. It emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, from the surrounding trees, as if it had always been part of the landscape rather than placed within it. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, thin and controlled, the only sign that it was not abandoned. Adrian felt something shift in his chest then, not relief, not yet, but recognition. This was not a dead lead. This was something real. He signaled for the driver to stop before the clearing, the vehicle coming to a quiet halt behind a bend that concealed it from direct view. For a moment he did nothing, his gaze fixed on the structure ahead, taking in every detail, the placement, the angles, the lack of visible security that was itself a form of concealment. If Mara Kane had chosen this place, then it was not unprotected. It was simply protected in ways that did not reveal themselves. Adrian stepped out into the cold, the air biting against his skin, grounding him in a way the city never could. He moved forward on foot, each step deliberate, controlled, his body adjusting automatically to the unfamiliar terrain. The closer he got, the more the silence pressed in, not empty but watchful, as if the land itself was aware of his presence. He reached the edge of the clearing and stopped, his eyes shifting toward a window that reflected the pale sky back at him. Then the reflection changed, just slightly, just enough to reveal movement inside. Adrian's breath slowed, his focus narrowing to a single point as he angled himself for a better view, careful, precise, the way a predator approaches something it has already decided to claim. And then he saw her. Alina Voss sat inside the cabin, her posture relaxed in a way he had never seen within the walls of his estate, her expression unguarded, untouched by the tension that had defined her life with him. In her arms the child shifted, small, alive, undeniable. His son, safe, whole, unafraid. The sight should have brought relief. Instead, it ignited something darker, something sharper, because there was no fear in her, no desperation, no sign that she had been running at all. She wasn't hiding. She was living. And in that moment, standing at the edge of a world that existed entirely outside his control, Adrian Voss understood that whatever came next would not be a retrieval. It would be a confrontation. The cold settled deeper, as if the mountain itself had drawn a line around the cabin and everything inside it, and Adrian Voss felt that line the moment he stepped across the clearing, not as resistance, but as a shift in control, subtle and unmistakable, the way a man knows when he is no longer the most dangerous presence in the room. He moved forward anyway, because retreat was not a language he understood, his boots pressing into damp earth, each step measured, silent, deliberate, until he reached the wooden steps of the porch where the air seemed thinner, sharper, charged with something that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the woman waiting inside. He did not knock. Knocking implied permission, and permission was not something he had ever needed. He pushed the door open with a controlled force, the hinges giving a low, protesting creak that broke the fragile stillness in a way that felt almost violent. The warmth inside hit him first, the contrast so stark it felt unreal, firelight casting soft movement across walls that carried none of his world's weight, none of its rules, none of its expectations. And then he saw her properly, not through glass or distance but in full, undeniable presence. Alina Voss stood slowly from the worn sofa, the child secure against her chest, her movements steady, unhurried, as if she had known this moment would come and had already decided how it would unfold. There was no panic in her posture, no frantic attempt to flee or shield herself, only a quiet, immovable resolve that altered the space between them more effectively than any weapon. For a fraction of a second, Adrian simply looked at her, his mind trying to reconcile the woman he had left behind with the one standing before him now, and the difference was not in her appearance but in something deeper, something fundamental that had shifted beyond his reach. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low, even carrying no tremor, no weakness, and the simplicity of it landed harder than accusation. Adrian stepped fully inside, letting the door fall shut behind him, sealing the space, his gaze flicking briefly to the child before returning to her face. "You took my son," he replied, his tone controlled, but beneath it something sharper moved, something closer to anger than he allowed himself to show. "You disappeared from my house, from my accounts, from my life. And you think I wouldn't come looking?" The words filled the room, but they did not dominate it the way his voice usually did. They hung there, waiting, as if the cabin itself refused to let them settle. A second presence shifted near the back of the room, subtle but immediate, and Adrian's attention snapped toward it just as Mara Kane stepped into view, her posture relaxed but alert, her eyes sharp in a way that suggested she had been watching him long before he crossed the threshold. There was no surprise in her expression, only assessment, as if she had already measured him against whatever standard she used and found him exactly as expected. "You shouldn't have found this place," she said, her voice carrying a different kind of calm, one that did not come from denial but from confidence in whatever defenses existed beyond what he could see. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, not at her words but at the implication behind them, the quiet assertion that his reach had limits. "This doesn't involve you," Adrian said, shifting his stance just enough to acknowledge her presence without granting her equal ground, his focus returning to Alina with a precision that bordered on fixation. "This is between me and my wife." Alina's expression didn't change at the word wife, didn't soften, didn't react at all, and that absence of response carried more weight than any argument could have. "No," she said quietly, adjusting the child against her shoulder as he stirred, his small hand curling into the fabric of her shirt. "This stopped being between us the moment you decided we were something you owned instead of something you loved." The words landed clean, unembellished, and for a moment the air shifted, not dramatically, but enough for Adrian to feel it, a slight fracture in the structure he had always relied on. He stepped closer, closing the distance in a way that had always worked before, intimidation layered into proximity, control reinforced through presence, but this time the effect was different. Alina did not step back. She did not flinch. She held her ground, her eyes locked onto his with a steadiness that made his approach feel, for the first time, uncertain. "You think this changes anything?" Adrian asked, his voice lowering, the edge of his composure beginning to sharpen into something more dangerous. "You think you can take my son, vanish into nowhere, and build a life that doesn't involve me? That's not how this works." His gaze flicked briefly to the child again, something possessive tightening in his expression. "You don't get to rewrite the rules." Mara shifted slightly, just enough for the movement to register without escalating, her attention moving between them with careful calculation. "She already did," she said, not loudly, not confrontationally, but with a certainty that cut through the room like a blade finding its mark. Adrian's eyes flicked toward her again, irritation flashing more visibly now, but before he could respond, Alina spoke again, her voice still calm, still controlled, but carrying something deeper beneath it. "I didn't run," she said, the words deliberate, each one placed with intent. "I left. There's a difference." She shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself, not retreating, not advancing, simply existing in a space that no longer belonged to him. "You keep saying you came to take him back," she continued, her gaze steady, "but you don't even know him. You don't know what calms him down at night. You don't know what makes him cry. You don't know the way he looks when he's about to fall asleep. You don't want him, Adrian. You want what he represents." Silence that followed was different now, no longer hollow or suffocating, but sharp, charged, filled with the kind of tension that precedes something irreversible. Adrian stood there, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by something far more complex, something he could not close simply by stepping forward. For the first time since this began, he wasn't facing a problem to be solved or an obstacle to be removed. He was facing a reality that did not respond to his control. And as that realization settled in, subtle but undeniable, the confrontation shifted from a man reclaiming what he believed was his to something far more dangerous. A man discovering that what he thought he owned had chosen to walk away and was not coming back. The fire cracked once, a sharp, dry sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and for a brief second it was the only movement in the room, the only thing not held tightly between breath and consequence. Adrian Voss stood where he had stopped, but something in him had shifted, not visibly, not in a way that could be pointed to. Yet the air around him changed, grew denser, more volatile, as if a decision had just been made that could not be undone. His gaze moved from Alina to the child in her arms again, but this time it lingered longer, not with curiosity, not even with recognition, but with a cold, calculating intensity that stripped the moment of anything resembling emotion. The silence stretched, and in that stretch, the fragile balance inside the cabin began to tilt. "You're done talking," Adrian said quietly, his voice flattening into something stripped of nuance, stripped of patience. It was not loud, not explosive, but it carried the weight of finality, the kind that preceded action rather than argument. Alina Voss didn't respond immediately, but her grip on the child tightened just enough to betray the instinct beneath her calm, a mother's reflex rising even as she held her ground. The baby stirred against her, sensing the shift before understanding it, a soft, uncertain sound escaping him that seemed to echo unnaturally in the charged stillness. Mara moved first, not forward, not aggressively, but into a position that closed angles, that adjusted the space without escalating it, her presence becoming more defined, more deliberate, her eyes never leaving Adrian's. Mara Kane had seen men like him before, men who mistook control for permanence, and there was something in her posture that acknowledged what was coming before it fully arrived. "Think very carefully about what you do next," she said, her tone calm but edged with something harder beneath, a warning that did not need to be raised to be understood. Adrian didn't even look at her this time. She was no longer part of the equation in his mind, only an obstacle that could be removed if necessary. It happened quickly but not suddenly, not in the way of chaos, but in the way of inevitability, like a line being crossed that had been drawn long before anyone noticed it. Adrian stepped forward in a single, decisive movement, closing the distance between himself and Alina before the moment could fracture into hesitation. She reacted instantly, pivoting, turning her body to shield the child, her free hand coming up as if that alone could hold him back, her voice breaking for the first time. "Don't, Adrian, don't." The words barely left her before his hand caught her wrist, firm, unyielding, the strength behind it making the difference between resistance and reality painfully clear. The baby cried then, sharp and sudden, the sound slicing through the room, escalating everything at once, turning tension into motion. Alina struggled, not with desperation but with precision, twisting, trying to create space, to keep distance between Adrian and the child, but he was already inside that space, already forcing it smaller. "Give him to me," Adrian said, his voice lower now, harsher, the edge of control cutting into something far more dangerous. "This ends now." There was no negotiation in it, no room left for argument, only the assertion of something he believed was absolute. Mara moved then, faster than before, the shift from stillness to action immediate and decisive, her hand closing around the iron poker near the fireplace, the metal catching the light as she stepped forward. "Let her go," she said, the calm gone now, replaced by something sharper, more direct, the kind of tone that came from someone who had already decided where the line was. Adrian turned just enough to register her movement, but not enough to disengage, not enough to release his grip. For a fraction of a second, the three of them existed in a perfect, fragile standoff, each locked into their position, each aware that the next movement would break something that could not be repaired. It broke. Adrian shifted his weight and pulled, using leverage instead of force, destabilizing Alina just enough to create an opening, his other hand moving toward the child with a speed that came from instinct rather than thought. Alina cried out, the sound raw, uncontrolled, as she fought to keep hold, her entire body turning into resistance, into protection, into something primal that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with survival. The baby's cries rose higher, sharper, filling the room with a frantic urgency that made everything feel closer, tighter, more immediate. The poker swung. It connected with a dull, jarring impact against Adrian's arm, the force enough to break his grip for a split second, enough to create space where none had existed. He staggered back half a step, the pain registering not as weakness but as interruption, his expression tightening, eyes flashing with something far darker now. Mara didn't hesitate, stepping forward again, placing herself between him and Alina, the weapon raised, her stance firm, unyielding. "I said let her go," she repeated, the words no longer a warning but a boundary. The room had changed completely now, the quiet warmth replaced by something volatile, something on the edge of violence that no longer needed permission to unfold. Adrian straightened slowly, the brief disruption already being absorbed, already being recalculated, his gaze moving from Mara back to Alina, to the child still pressed against her, still crying, still the center of everything. The control he had walked in with was gone, replaced by something rawer, something more dangerous because it was no longer restrained by the illusion of inevitability. And in that moment, with the fire crackling behind them and the child's cries filling the space, it became clear that this was no longer a confrontation that could be resolved through words or authority. This was the point where everything would either break or burn. The courtroom did not roar when Adrian Voss was led in. It absorbed him, the way stone absorbs sound, the way institutions absorb men who once believed themselves untouchable. Cameras waited outside, voices and flashes and speculation, but inside there was only structure, wood, steel, the slow grind of procedure, and a silence that felt heavier than any accusation. Adrian moved with the same measured control he had carried into every room of power, his suit immaculate, his posture unbroken, but the weight around him had changed, no longer the invisible shield of influence but something colder, something that pressed in from all sides. The charges had been laid out in precise, clinical language: unlawful entry, assault, endangerment, attempted abduction. Words that stripped intention down to action, action down to consequence. Across the room, Alina Voss sat with a stillness that was not fragile but deliberate, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze forward, not fixed on Adrian, not seeking him, not acknowledging him in the way he expected. The child was not present, kept away from this place of judgment, but his absence was felt more sharply than his presence ever could have been, a quiet reminder of what this room was truly about. Beside Alina, Mara Kane leaned back with an ease that seemed almost out of place, but her eyes missed nothing, tracking every movement, every shift, as if she were cataloging the room the way she had once cataloged identities and exits. She did not look like a woman on trial for anything. She looked like someone who had already chosen her side and accepted the cost. Adrian's legal team spoke first, their voices confident, controlled, constructing a narrative that framed him as a father acting under pressure, a man driven to extreme measures by fear for his child's safety. They spoke of instability, of sudden disappearance, of a wife who had erased herself and taken a newborn into isolation, framing Alina's actions as reckless, unpredictable, dangerous. The words were polished, rehearsed, built to persuade, and for a moment the structure held. Adrian sat without interruption, his expression carefully neutral, allowing the story to form around him, because this was a battlefield he understood: contracts, arguments, controlled perception. But the prosecution did not rush. They dismantled slowly, deliberately, each piece removed with care until the shape of the defense began to collapse under its own weight. Evidence was introduced not as spectacle but as inevitability. Security footage from the cabin, grainy but clear enough to show force, to show escalation, to show the moment where intention crossed into action. Medical reports detailing injuries, not severe but sufficient enough to prove contact, to prove violence. Financial records that revealed something Adrian had believed buried, the inquiries he had made weeks before Alina left, the consultations with legal advisors about custody, about leverage, about ways to secure control before any separation occurred. A murmur moved through the room then, subtle but unmistakable, the shift from uncertainty to recognition, from narrative to truth. Adrian felt it, even if he did not show it, the way a current changes direction beneath the surface of still water. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in the controlled image he had maintained since entering. This was no longer about perception. This was about pattern, and patterns, once revealed, were difficult to argue against. Then came the testimony that fractured what remained. Vanessa Cole took the stand with a hesitation that was real, not performed, her posture smaller than it had been in the world Adrian knew, her voice quieter but carrying further because of it. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She simply spoke, recounting the drive, the plan, the words Adrian had used, the way he had framed the situation not as recovery but as correction. Property, she said at one point, her eyes briefly flicking toward him before dropping again. He called the baby his property. The word landed harder than any accusation, stripping away the last layer of defense, exposing something raw and undeniable beneath. Adrian did not react outwardly, but something inside him shifted, not in denial but in recognition of the narrative forming without him, the version of events solidifying in the minds of those who would decide his fate. Control, the thing he had relied on in every other arena, had no place here once the structure turned against him. The law did not bend the way people did. It did not fear him. It did not negotiate. When the verdict came, it did not arrive with drama. It was read plainly, the words measured, each one landing with finality. Guilty. The repetition of it stripped away any remaining illusion, reducing everything that had happened, the hunt, the confrontation, the belief that he could still dictate the outcome, into a sequence of consequences he could no longer alter. Adrian stood as it was delivered, because standing was expected, because falling was not something he allowed, even now, even here. Across the room, Alina did not move. She did not smile, did not show relief, did not acknowledge victory in any visible way. She simply remained as she was, composed, distant, her gaze steady and unreadable. There was no triumph in her expression, only something quieter, something deeper, the calm of someone who had already won long before this room was ever involved. And as Adrian Voss stood there, the weight of the decision settling into place, something became unmistakably clear. He had not lost in that cabin. He had lost the moment she decided to leave. Everything that followed had simply been the world catching up to that choice. Snow fell in quiet layers that did not announce themselves, each flake settling over rooftops, sidewalks, and the edges of a small town that existed far from the reach of men who believed they owned the world. The streets were narrow here, the buildings modest, their windows warm with light that belonged to ordinary lives, and inside one of them, tucked between a bakery and a closed antique shop, a bell chimed softly as the door opened and then closed again. Alina Voss stood behind a wooden counter worn smooth by time, her sleeves rolled just enough to reveal hands that had learned to build instead of endure, her movements steady, unhurried, carrying none of the tension that had once defined her days. The air smelled of paper, coffee, and something faintly sweet drifting from the back where a small kitchen hummed with quiet life. This place did not look like an escape. It looked like something chosen. A child's laughter broke the calm, bright and unrestrained, and it cut through the stillness in a way that felt like sunlight after a long storm. He moved between shelves that towered above him like gentle walls, his small hands brushing spines, his curiosity uncontained, his presence undeniable. He had grown since that night, no longer the fragile weight pressed protectively against Alina's chest, but something stronger, louder, alive in a way that did not carry fear. She watched him with a softness that did not weaken her, a quiet attention that held the room together more effectively than any lock or weapon ever had. When he looked back at her, his grin wide and unguarded, there was no shadow of the life he had left behind, no echo of the man who had once claimed him as legacy instead of life. In the back, Mara Kane moved with the same efficiency she had once used to dismantle identities, now redirected into something that resembled permanence. Flour dusted her hands as she checked the oven, her expression focused but lighter, as if the skills that had once erased people were now being used to sustain something instead of destroy it. She did not look like a woman hiding. She looked like someone who had finally chosen where to stand. The past had not vanished. It lingered in the precision of her movements, in the way her eyes still tracked exits without thinking, but it no longer defined the space she occupied. Alina turned toward the window, the glass cool beneath her fingertips as she looked out at the snow gathering along the street, covering everything with a quiet insistence that felt less like concealment and more like renewal. Somewhere beyond this place, beyond these mountains and miles of distance, Adrian Voss existed in a world that had closed around him, its walls no longer invisible, its rules no longer negotiable. She did not think of him often, not in the way she once had, not with anger or fear, but as something that had belonged to a life she had already left behind. He had built his empire on control, on certainty, on the belief that nothing within his reach could move without his command, and in the end, it had not been force that broke that belief but something quieter, something he had never accounted for. Choice. The bell chimed again as a customer stepped inside, bringing with them a gust of cold air and the faint sound of boots against snow, and Alina turned back toward the counter, her attention shifting effortlessly, her posture relaxed but grounded. The moment did not feel like an ending. It did not carry the dramatic weight of victory or the sharp edge of revenge. It felt like something far more dangerous to the world she had left behind. It felt like peace. Her son ran toward her then, his laughter filling the room, his small hands reaching up without hesitation, without doubt, and she lifted him easily, his warmth anchoring her in a way nothing else ever had. He pressed his cheek against her shoulder, already distracted by something else, already moving forward in a way that did not carry the past with him. She held him for a moment longer than necessary, not out of fear of losing him, but out of the quiet understanding of what it had taken to keep him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering footprints, softening edges, turning the world into something new with each passing second. Inside, the warmth held, steady and real, built not on power or fear, but on something far more enduring. And as Alina stepped away from the window and back into the life she had chosen, one truth settled into place, with a clarity that needed no words. She had not just escaped a man. She had rewritten the ending he thought he controlled, and built a life where he no longer existed at all.